Chloe adjusted the sleeve of her wedding dress for the third time, trying to make the lace lay flatter over her arm. Her mother, Nora, sat 2 tables away in a soft grey dress, hands folded, smiling the careful smile of someone who had spent her whole life trying not to be noticed. The reception hall at the country club glittered with white orchids and crystal chandeliers. 200 guests filled the room, most of them Harrison's family friends and business partners. Chloe barely knew half of them. She had married into this world 3 hours ago, and already it felt like a costume that didn't fit. Harrison stood near the head table, laughing at something his father said, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, his smile perfectly rehearsed. He was handsome in the way that magazine covers were handsome, polished, expensive, empty. It was during the toasts that everything fell apart. Harrison's aunt, a thin woman dripping in diamonds, leaned toward Nora's table and said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "And who exactly is that woman in the grey dress? She looks like she wandered in from the kitchen staff." A ripple of laughter passed through the nearby tables. Chloe's stomach dropped. She started to rise from her seat, but Harrison beat her to it, and not in the way she hoped. He crossed the floor toward Nora, his jaw tight, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. "This is a 5-star event. My mother spent months planning this, and you—" He looked Nora up and down, taking in the plain dress, the simple shoes, the hands roughened from years of hard work. "You couldn't even manage to look presentable for your own daughter's wedding." Nora's face went pale. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Chloe pushed through the crowd, her heart pounding. "Harrison, stop! That's my mother!" "I know exactly who she is," Harrison said, not even glancing at his new wife. "And frankly, Chloe, I don't understand how someone like you ended up looking the way you do either. My family has a certain image to maintain. I thought marrying you meant you understood that." The words landed like a slap. Chloe had heard comments about her weight her whole life, whispered behind hands, printed in cruel captions under photos she never asked to be tagged in. But she had never expected to hear it from her own husband, on her wedding day, in front of everyone who mattered to him. Harrison turned toward the entrance, where 2 security guards in dark suits stood near the door. "Get her out of here," he said, nodding at Nora. "She's embarrassing my family." The guards exchanged an uncertain look, but began walking toward Nora's table. Nora rose slowly, gripping the back of her chair, her eyes glassy with tears she refused to let fall. Chloe felt something inside her crack. Not just anger, but a grief she didn't have words for yet. Then the doors at the far end of the hall opened. 10 black Rolls-Royces had pulled into the circular driveway outside, engines humming low, headlights cutting through the evening dusk. Guests near the windows turned to look, murmuring. The security guards froze mid-step. A man walked in first. He was young, maybe 27, with dark hair combed back and a long black coat draped over broad shoulders. He moved like someone who had never once questioned whether a room would make space for him. Behind him came a dozen more men in dark suits, quiet and watchful, fanning out along the walls without a single word spoken. The room went silent. Harrison's father stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "We weren't told you'd be attending." Dominic Sterling didn't answer. His eyes moved past Harrison entirely, as if the groom wasn't even worth acknowledging, and landed on Nora. Something shifted in his expression. The hard, unreadable look softened into something almost reverent. He crossed the room in a few long strides and stopped in front of her. Then, without a word of explanation to anyone watching, he slid the coat off his own shoulders and draped it gently over Nora's, the way someone might cover a person they had been searching for their entire life. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said quietly, his voice carrying anyway in the stunned silence. "I owe you more than you know. No one speaks to you like that. Not in my presence and not ever again." Chloe stared, uncomprehending. Her mother knew this man? A syndicate leader whose name made grown businessmen sit up straighter. Harrison found his voice first, though it came out thin. "This is a private event. I don't know who you think you are." Dominic finally looked at him. Just once, just long enough for Harrison to understand exactly how small he had become in this man's eyes. "I know exactly who I am," Dominic said. "The question is whether you understand what you just did." Chloe looked at her mother's face, streaked with tears, wrapped in a stranger's coat, and realized the wedding she'd walked into that morning was not the story she thought she was living at all. For a long moment, nobody moved. The string quartet in the corner had stopped playing somewhere in the middle of a note, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any music could have been. Chloe stood between two worlds, the husband she had promised herself to that morning and the mother she had just watched get humiliated in front of 200 strangers. Her hands were shaking. She looked down at the ring on her finger, the one Harrison had slid on with such confidence just hours earlier, and something in her chest went cold and clear at the same time.
"Chloe," Harrison said, his voice lower now, aware of the eyes on him.
"Let's not make a scene. We can talk about this later, privately." "Privately," Chloe repeated. She almost laughed. "You had security walk toward my mother in front of your entire family, Harrison. There's nothing private left to protect." His father tried to smooth things over, stepping forward with a tight smile aimed at the room rather than at Chloe. "Everyone, please, let's enjoy the evening. This is simply a small misunderstanding between family." "It's not a misunderstanding." Chloe's voice cut through his, steadier than she expected. She reached up and unclasped the delicate necklace Harrison had given her that morning as an engagement gift. The one he'd made a point of mentioning had cost more than most people's cars. She set it on the table beside his untouched wedding cake slice. Then she slid the ring off her finger. Harrison's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" "Ending this before it starts." She placed the ring gently in his open palm and closed his fingers around it herself, the way you might hand something fragile back who never deserved it in the first place. "You can tell your guests whatever story makes you comfortable. I don't need to be here for it." She turned to her mother, who was still wrapped in Dominic's coat, looking somewhere between stunned and afraid to hope. "Mom, let's go." Harrison grabbed for her wrist, panic flashing across his face for the first time all evening. "Chloe, think about what you're doing. My family, your family's reputation, all of this." Dominic stepped between them so smoothly it seemed almost casual, though the message underneath it was anything but. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Take your hand off her," he said. Harrison released her wrist like it had burned him. Dominic offered Nora his arm, and she took it with the kind of trembling gratitude that comes from being protected after too many years of standing alone. Chloe fell into step beside them, her heels clicking against the marble floor, refusing to look back at the tables full of guests who had watched the whole thing unfold like it was dinner theater. Outside, the evening air was cool and smelled like cut grass and expensive cologne. The 10 Rolls-Royces sat in a perfect line along the circular drive, their black paint catching the last orange light of the sunset. Dominic's men opened the door of the lead car without being asked. "Please," Dominic said to Nora, gesturing toward the open door. "You shouldn't have to spend another minute in that building." Nora hesitated at the threshold of the car, glancing back at the country club, at the life she had spent decades trying to protect her daughter from ever having to think about. "Dominic," she said softly, using his first name like it belonged to her memory as much as his present. "You didn't have to come." "I've owed you a debt since before Chloe was born," he said. "I was never going to let it go unpaid." Chloe climbed in after her mother, and Dominic slid in across from them, the door closing with a soft, expensive click that shut out the noise of the reception entirely. Through the tinted window, Chloe caught one last glimpse of Harrison, standing on the steps of the club, his tuxedo jacket askew, watching the convoy pull away with an expression she couldn't quite read. Fear, maybe. Or the beginning of understanding that something much bigger than a broken marriage had just happened. The cars pulled out one by one, engines low and smooth, and the country club shrank behind them until it was just lights in the distance. Inside the car, nobody spoke for a while. Nora sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing, and Chloe realized her mother was crying. Not the humiliated tears from the reception hall, but something quieter, something that looked almost like relief. "Mum," Chloe finally said, "who is he to you? Really?" Nora glanced at Dominic, who gave the smallest nod, as if giving her permission to decide how much to say. "It's a long story," Nora said. "Longer than you know." "I have time," Chloe said. "I think today just cleared my whole schedule." That earned the faintest smile from her mother, fragile but real. Dominic watched the two of them with an unreadable calm, his phone buzzing once in his pocket, which he ignored entirely. "We're not going back to the city tonight," he said instead, looking out the window as the countryside rolled past in the dark. "There's somewhere safer, somewhere we can talk properly, away from cameras and phones and anyone who thinks they still have a claim on either of you." Chloe looked at her mother, then at the stranger who had walked into her wedding like he owned the room, who spoke about her mother like she was something precious he'd been protecting from a distance for years. Whatever story was waiting for her at the end of this drive, she had the sinking feeling it was going to change everything she thought she understood about her own life. The estate sat at the end of a long gravel drive, hidden behind a wall of pine trees that made it nearly invisible from the road. Chloe hadn't expected something so quiet. She had pictured a Mafia boss's home as loud somehow, all marble and gold. But this place looked more like an old farmhouse that had been restored with care rather than money thrown at it for show. Warm light spilled from the windows. A fire was already burning in the front room when they walked in, as though someone had known they were coming long before Chloe herself had known. Nora sat down on a worn leather couch and finally let herself breathe. Dominic disappeared briefly and returned with a pot of tea, pouring it himself rather than calling for staff, which struck Chloe as strange for a man who arrived at weddings with 10 cars and a dozen bodyguards. "Okay," Chloe said, once the door was closed and it was just the three of them. "I think I've been patient enough. Mom, how do you know him? And don't tell me it's a long story again because we have all night." Nora wrapped both hands around her teacup, staring into it like the answer might be written in the steam. "Your father," she said slowly, "wasn't just a small business owner, Chloe. Not really. Not underneath what I let you believe." "What does that mean?" Dominic set a leather folder on the coffee table between them. "Your father's name was Walter Whitfield. 15 years ago, my family's company was 3 weeks from bankruptcy. My father had made bad investments, and creditors were closing in fast enough that we were going to lose everything. The business, the properties, all of it. Nobody would touch us. Every bank in the city had already decided we were finished." Chloe glanced at her mother, who kept her eyes fixed on the fire. "Your father ran a small logistics company," Dominic continued. "Nothing glamorous. But he had built relationships over 20 years that my father never had, connections with shipping partners who trusted him personally. When everyone else turned us away, Walter co-signed a loan that saved my family from collapse. He put his entire company on the line for a man he barely knew because he believed my father deserved a second chance." "Why would he do that?" Chloe asked. "Because that's who he was," Nora said quietly, finally looking up. "Your father believed people could be trusted until they proved otherwise. It cost him more than once. It nearly cost him everything that time." Dominic opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. It showed 2 men shaking hands outside a warehouse, one of them clearly younger, both of them smiling in a way that suggested relief more than celebration. Chloe recognized her father immediately, younger than she remembered him, his hair not yet grey. "When he died," Dominic said, "the debt should have transferred to my family in the other direction. We owed you everything. My father wanted to repay it publicly, set your mother up with security, a new house, whatever she needed. But she refused." "I refused," Nora said, "because I didn't want that life anywhere near you, Chloe. You were 4 years old. I had already lost your father to a heart attack no one saw coming, and the last thing I wanted was for my daughter to grow up surrounded by armed men and constant threats, always looking over her shoulder because of a debt that wasn't even hers to carry." "So you just disappeared," Chloe said, piecing it together. You changed our whole life. The small apartment, the sewing job, all those years of barely making rent. You could have had help." "I had help," Nora said. "Just quiet help. Dominic's family made sure we were never truly in danger, never truly without options, even when I insisted on living small. He checked on us every year, Chloe. You just never knew it was him." Chloe felt something twist inside her chest. A strange mix of gratitude and grief for years she hadn't understood were being carefully managed from a distance. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because I wanted you to have a normal life," Nora said, her voice breaking slightly. "I wanted you to fall in love with someone because of who you are, not because your mother came with a syndicate attached to her name. I wanted you to choose your own path completely free of any of this." Dominic leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, watching Chloe carefully. "Your mother refused every offer my family made for 15 years. Today, when I heard where the wedding was being held and whose son you were marrying, I made a decision on my own. I wasn't going to sit back and let anyone treat her the way Harrison did. Debt or no debt." Chloe sat back, trying to absorb all of it at once. Her father's quiet generosity, her mother's fierce, silent sacrifice, and this man across from her who had apparently been watching over both of them from the shadows for over a decade, waiting for a moment neither of them ever asked him to create. "So, what happens now?" Chloe asked. "I just walked out on my own wedding. I have no idea what Harrison's family is going to do, what people are already saying about us tonight." Dominic's expression shifted, something colder and more focused settling behind his eyes. "Harrison's family has more to worry about than gossip," he said. "There are things about that marriage arrangement neither of you fully understood. Things I intend to make very clear to them, starting tomorrow." Nora looked up sharply. "Dominic, what do you mean?" "I mean," he said, "Harrison's father didn't marry his son into your family by accident. There's a reason that wedding happened exactly when it did, and it has very little to do with love." Chloe felt the floor shift beneath her all over again. Chloe barely slept that night. She lay in the guest room at Dominic's estate, staring at the ceiling, replaying Dominic's words over and over. "There's a reason that wedding happened exactly when it did, and it has very little to do with love." By morning, she had a headache and about 100 unanswered questions, and her phone had 31 missed calls, all from Harrison. She found her mother already in the kitchen, sipping coffee at a small table by the window, looking more rested than Chloe had seen her in years. Dominic was on the phone in the next room, his voice low and clipped, the kind of tone that made whoever was on the other end do exactly what he said without arguing. "He called all night," Chloe said, setting her phone face down on the table. "I didn't answer." "Good," Nora said simply. Chloe almost smiled at how unlike her mother that sounded. The woman who had spent 15 years telling her to always be polite, always give people the benefit of the doubt. Something had shifted in Nora overnight. Some old weight lifted just enough to let a sharper version of her show through. Dominic walked in a few minutes later, his sleeves rolled up, a folder tucked under his arm like he'd already put in half a day's work before breakfast. "Harrison's been trying to reach me too," he said, sitting down across from them. 6 calls since 7 this morning. I let all of them go to voicemail." "What's he even trying to accomplish?" Chloe asked. "I already gave the ring back. It's over." "It's not that simple for his family," Dominic said. "Not anymore." He opened the folder and spread a few documents across the table, corporate letterheads, columns of numbers, dates circled in red pen. Chloe recognized the name at the top of the first page immediately. Whitmore Holdings, Harrison's family business. "I run a legal holding company that manages several partnership agreements across the finance sector," Dominic explained. "Whitmore Holdings has 3 active credit lines tied to contracts my firm oversees. This morning, I instructed my legal team to freeze all 3, effective immediately." Nora set down her coffee cup. "Dominic, is that necessary? Chloe already left. The marriage is over. Do we really need to punish an entire company?" "It's not punishment," Dominic said, though his voice had an edge underneath the calm. "It's enforcement. Every one of those agreements includes an ethical partnership clause. What happened at that reception? A grown man humiliating a woman in public, ordering security to remove her. That's a direct violation. I'm not inventing a reason to go after them. They handed me one. Chloe stared at the numbers on the page, most of them meaningless to her, but the weight behind them was obvious even without understanding the details. How much money are we talking about? Enough that Harrison's father will notice within the hour, Dominic said. Enough that by this afternoon, he'll be calling every contact he has, trying to figure out who pulled the rug out from under him. As if summoned by the sentence itself, Chloe's phone buzzed against the table. Harrison's name lit up the screen again. She stared at it for a long moment before flipping the phone over without answering. You should probably expect this to get louder before it gets quieter, Dominic said, watching her. Men like Harrison's father don't handle losing control well. He'll try charm first. When that doesn't work, he'll try pressure. It might come through your phone, through mutual friends, maybe even through people at your own workplace. I don't have a workplace anymore, Chloe said, more bitterly than she meant to. I quit my job 2 months ago because Harrison said it would look better if I focused on the wedding and the foundation his family wanted me to run. Nora reached over and took her hand. You'll figure out what comes next. You always have. Dominic's phone buzzed on the table between them, and he glanced at the screen before turning it toward Chloe so she could see the caller ID. Whitmore, Gerald, Harrison's father. Do you want me to take this somewhere else? Dominic asked. No, Chloe said, surprising herself. Put it on speaker. I want to hear what he says. Dominic raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. He answered and set the phone in the middle of the table. Sterling. Gerald Whitmore's voice came through, tight and controlled in the way of a man trying very hard not to sound desperate. I think there's been a misunderstanding regarding our credit lines this morning. There's no misunderstanding, Dominic said. Your son publicly humiliated a woman under my family's protection. The partnership terms are clear on ethical conduct. I'm well within my rights. A pause. Chloe could almost hear the gears turning on the other end. Look, Gerald said, his tone shifting, softer now, almost pleading. Whatever happened between them, that's between them. It doesn't need to involve the business. We've worked together for years, Dominic. Surely we can resolve this like reasonable men. You should have thought of reasonable before your son had security walk toward Nora Whitfield, Dominic said. I suggest you spend today finding another lender, Gerald, because those credit lines aren't reopening on my end. He ended the call before Gerald could respond, setting the phone down with a quiet finality that filled the whole kitchen. Chloe looked at her mother, then at Dominic, feeling something unfamiliar rising in her chest beneath the exhaustion and confusion of the last 24 hours. It wasn't just relief anymore. It was the beginning of something that felt almost like power. By the second day, Chloe had made a decision. She wasn't going to sit inside Dominic's estate waiting for other people to handle her life for her, no matter how grateful she was for the protection. She called her attorney, Diane Marsh, a woman she'd worked with years ago when she still had her own consulting business, before Harrison convinced her to give it up for the sake of appearances. I need to file for an annulment, Chloe said, standing in the estate's front hallway with her coat already on, as fast as legally possible. I can have paperwork ready by this afternoon, Diane said, but Chloe, I have to ask, are you sure? Given who your husband's family is, this could get messy. I'm sure, Chloe said. It's already messy. I'd rather it be messy on my terms. Dominic offered a car and driver, which Chloe accepted, though she made a point of going alone. She needed 1 hour, just one, where she wasn't the woman being rescued by a Mafia boss or the daughter uncovering a hidden past. She needed to be a person handling her own paperwork like anyone else going through the worst week of her life. Diane's office sat on the 14th floor of a building downtown, all glass and quiet hallways. Chloe sat across from her attorney's desk while Diane pulled up the marriage documents on her computer, scrolling through pages Chloe had signed without reading closely enough 2 weeks before the wedding. There's something you should see, Diane said, frowning at the screen. Did Harrison ever mention amending the prenuptial agreement after your engagement? No, Chloe said. We signed one in January. That was it. There's a second document here, Diane said, turning the monitor toward her. Filed 11 days ago. It looks like an addendum, quietly added to the original agreement. Chloe leaned forward, scanning the legal language until her eyes caught a section near the bottom. One clause repeated twice in slightly different wording, just to be thorough. Her stomach turned cold as she read it. "What is this?" she said quietly. "About my mother's property." Diane pulled the clause up larger. It states that in the event of a legal separation or annulment initiated by either party, control of any real estate held under Nora Whitfield's name, if connected to the marital household through shared residence or financial support, transfers partial ownership rights to the Whitmore Family Trust. "My mother doesn't even live with us," Chloe said. "She has her own apartment, small, nothing valuable." "It's not really about value," Diane said gently. "It's about control. This clause would have let them claim a stake in anything she owns, simply by arguing you provided financial support to her at some point during the marriage. Did you ever send her money? Help with rent? Anything like that?" Chloe's throat tightened. "I paid off the last 6 months of her lease as a birthday gift. Harrison knew about it. He said it was a generous thing to do." "That's exactly the kind of thing this clause was built to catch," Diane said. "Chloe, I don't think this was carelessness. Someone drafted this very specifically and very recently." Chloe sat back in her chair, feeling sick. 11 days ago. That was after the guest list had been finalized, after the caterers were booked, after every detail of a wedding that was supposedly about love had already been locked into place. Someone in Harrison's family had looked at her mother's modest life and decided it was worth writing into a legal document, quietly, hoping no one would notice until it was too late to matter. "I need copies of everything," Chloe said. "Every version, every date it was filed, who signed off on it." Diane nodded, already printing. "I'll have it ready within the hour. And Chloe, given what you're describing, I think it's worth mentioning this to whoever's handling your protection right now. This isn't just about wounded pride anymore. Someone was planning for this marriage to end a certain way, and planning to profit from it if it did." Chloe thought about Dominic's words from the day before. There's a reason that wedding happened exactly when it did, and it has very little to do with love, and felt the pieces sliding into place with an ugly clarity. This hadn't been a spontaneous cruelty from Harrison at the reception. It had been building for weeks, maybe longer, hidden behind smiling toasts and expensive flowers. She left the office with a folder of documents pressed against her chest, like something fragile, though what was inside it felt more like a weapon than anything breakable. Outside, the driver was waiting exactly where Dominic had promised, engine already running. When she got back to the estate, she found her mother in the garden, cutting fresh herbs for dinner like the last 2 days hadn't upended everything either of them thought they understood about their lives. Chloe held up the folder. "They wrote a clause into the prenup," she said, "about your apartment, trying to claim a piece of it if the marriage ended." Nora's hands went still over the herbs. "My apartment," she repeated, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. "There's nothing there worth stealing, Chloe. A few boxes of your father's old letters and a couch that's older than you are." "That's not the point," Chloe said. "The point is they were already planning for this to fail. They wrote it into the paperwork before the wedding even happened." Nora set down her scissors slowly, understanding dawning behind her eyes. "Then whatever Dominic is planning," she said, "I think it's time we let him do it properly. Because clearly, Gerald Whitmore was never planning to play fair either." Chloe hadn't planned on leaving the estate again that week, but 3 days into the isolation, she needed air that didn't smell like fireplace smoke and old money. A friend from her consulting days, Priya, was showing new work at a small gallery in Soho, and Chloe decided one quiet evening surrounded by paintings instead of lawyers might do her some good. Dominic offered a driver again. This time she let 2 of his security men wait outside rather than argue about it. After the prenup discovery, even she had to admit walking around the city alone probably wasn't the smartest decision. The gallery was small and warmly lit. Exposed brick walls hung with abstract landscapes, a handful of people drifting between them with wine glasses in hand. For nearly an hour, Chloe let herself forget. She talked to Priya about brushstrokes and color palettes, laughed for the first time in days at something that had nothing to do with mafia bosses or corporate holding companies. Then she turned around and saw Harrison standing near the entrance. He looked different than he had at the wedding. His tie was loosened, his usual polish frayed at the edges, dark circles under his eyes that no amount of concealer could have hidden even if he'd tried. For a moment, Chloe almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Chloe," he said, crossing the room toward her, ignoring the curious glances from nearby guests. "Can we talk, please?" "There's nothing left to talk about, Harrison." "There's everything left to talk about." His voice cracked slightly, and for the first time since she'd known him, he sounded less like a man performing confidence and more like someone genuinely afraid. "My father's furious. Sterling froze our credit lines. Do you understand what that means for the company, for our family?" "I understand exactly what it means," Chloe said. "I also understand there's a clause in our prenup about my mother's apartment, added 11 days before our wedding. Care to explain that?" Harrison's face went through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, then something like guilt, then a scramble to recover. "I didn't know about that. My father's lawyers handle those documents. I never even read the final version closely." "You signed it, Harrison." "I trusted my father to protect our interests," he said. "I didn't think there was anything to hide." "There was plenty to hide," Chloe said. "You just didn't bother checking what." A few gallery guests had started to notice the tension, drifting a polite distance away while still clearly listening. Harrison lowered his voice, stepping closer. "Chloe, please, come back. We can fix this quietly, before it becomes something neither of our families can undo. I'll talk to my father about the clause. I'll make sure your mother's property is completely untouched, whatever you want." "What I want," Chloe said, "is for you to understand that this was never about a dress or a weight comment at a wedding reception. You looked at my mother, a woman who has worked her entire life to give me everything I have, and you decided she wasn't good enough to be seen next to your family's name. That tells me everything I need to know about what you actually think of me, too." "That's not fair," Harrison said. "I love you, Chloe. You loved the version of me that made your family look generous for marrying someone bigger than the women in your usual circles," Chloe said, the words coming out steadier than she expected, like she'd been carrying them unspoken for longer than she realized. "You loved being able to tell people how accepting you were. The moment my mother embarrassed that story in front of your guests, you dropped the act in about 4 seconds. Harrison opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. For a long moment he just stood there, and Chloe watched something in his expression crumble. Whether from guilt or simple exhaustion, she couldn't tell anymore, and didn't especially care to find out. "Please," he tried again, quieter now, almost pathetic. "Just give me a chance to explain everything. In private. Not here." "There's nothing private left between us," Chloe said. "You made sure of that yourself, in front of 200 people. That was when 2 of Dominic's security men, who had been standing near the gallery entrance the entire time without drawing attention to themselves, stepped forward. They didn't touch Harrison, didn't raise their voices. One of them simply positioned himself between Chloe and Harrison with the quiet, immovable presence of someone used to ending conversations without needing to explain why. "Sir," the guard said evenly, "I think it's time you left." Harrison looked at the guard, then back at Chloe, some last flicker of pride trying to reassert itself. "This isn't over, Chloe. My father's already talking to his own lawyers. Whatever Sterling thinks he's protecting you from, it's not going to be that simple." "Nothing about this week has been simple, Harrison," Chloe said. "I stopped expecting simple the moment 10 Rolls-Royces pulled up to my wedding." He held her gaze for one more second, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, then turned and walked out of the gallery without another word. The guards fell back into their quiet positions near the door, and the room slowly returned to its low hum of conversation, as though nothing had happened at all. Priya appeared at Chloe's elbow, wide-eyed. "Okay, you have to tell me everything, all of it, starting from the Rolls-Royces. Chloe managed a tired laugh, the tension in her shoulders finally easing. "It's a long story," she said, echoing her mother's words from days earlier, understanding now exactly how true that sentence was. "Longer than you'd believe." Dominic called a meeting for the following morning, and this time he wanted it done properly, in a boardroom instead of a kitchen table.
Chloe arrived with her mother at Vance Enterprise headquarters, a glass tower in the financial district that looked nothing like the quiet estate she'd spent the last several days hiding inside. The lobby alone was bigger than the entire country club that had hosted her wedding. They rode the elevator to the top floor in silence. Nora kept smoothing the front of her blazer, a habit Chloe recognized from years of watching her mother prepare for job interviews she was overqualified for and never got. Back when appearances decided everything and nobody bothered to look past them. "You don't have to be nervous," Chloe said. "We're not the ones who did anything wrong here." "I know," Nora said. "It's just strange, being somewhere this large because of your father. He would have hated this building. Too much glass, he always said. Nowhere to hide when you needed to think." The boardroom held a long table of dark wood, a wall of windows overlooking the city, and Dominic already seated at the head with a stack of folders in front of him. Two of his advisors sat nearby, quiet and attentive, and a woman Chloe didn't recognize stood near a screen at the far end of the room, ready to pull up documents. "Thank you for coming," Dominic said, standing briefly as they took their seats. "I wanted you both to see this directly, rather than hear it secondhand." The woman by the screen brought up a set of financial records, columns of numbers Chloe didn't fully understand at a glance, but the shape of the story was clear enough even before Dominic began explaining it. 18 months ago, Dominic said, Gerald Whitmore approached my firm for a significant business loan. Whitmore Holdings was overextended on several failed real estate ventures, and traditional banks weren't willing to take the risk anymore. My firm agreed to the loan, but under one condition. "What condition?" Chloe asked. "Collateral," Dominic said. "Not property, not equity in the company, at least not directly. Gerald offered something else instead, something my legal team should have flagged immediately, and something I only discovered myself 2 days ago while reviewing the original contract line by line." He nodded to the woman at the screen, and a new document appeared, a section highlighted in yellow near the bottom of a page dense with legal language. The loan's terms included a performance clause tied to family alliance, Dominic said. In plain language, Gerald guaranteed that his son would marry into a family with strong personal ties to my organization, as a gesture of good faith and long-term partnership. If that alliance failed to materialize, or failed within its first year, the loan balance would come due immediately, in full, with penalty interest attached. Chloe stared at the screen. "He used Harrison's marriage as collateral for a business loan?" "Essentially, yes," Dominic said. "He knew about my family's history with your father. He knew, or at least suspected, that I would eventually make my connection to your mother known publicly, once the right moment presented itself. Marrying his son to you wasn't a coincidence. It was a calculated bet that tying his family to yours would strengthen his standing with mine, whether either of you understood the arrangement or not." Nora's hands tightened around the edge of the table. "So Harrison never actually chose Chloe," she said quietly. "His father chose her because of me." "I believe Harrison genuinely cared for Chloe, in whatever limited way he's capable of," Dominic said. "But the marriage itself, the timing, the pressure to move quickly toward the wedding, that was his father's doing, built entirely around this loan agreement." Chloe felt something cold settle in her chest, replacing the anger from the gallery with something closer to disbelief. "Everything about our relationship, from the beginning, was any of it real?" "That's not something I can answer for you," Dominic said, his voice softening slightly. "But I can tell you the paperwork doesn't lie. The wedding needed to happen, and needed to survive at least 12 months, or Whitmore Holdings would default on a loan large enough to collapse the entire company." "And now the marriage has ended in 5 days, Chloe said slowly, understanding dawning. "Now the marriage has ended in 5 days, Dominic confirmed. "Which means, according to the terms Gerald himself signed,
The loan is in default as of this morning. Chloe sat back in her chair, trying to process the scale of what she was hearing. She had walked into that country club expecting the biggest event of her life to be a wedding. Instead, it had turned into the opening move of a financial collapse that had apparently been engineered around her without her knowledge, built on her mother's quiet debt from 15 years earlier and her own naive trust in a man who never once told her the truth. "What happens now?" Nora asked. "To the company? To Harrison's family?" Dominic closed the folder in front of him, his expression unreadable. "That depends," he said, looking directly at Chloe, "on what the two of you want to happen next. I have the legal standing to seize the collateral outright, but there's another option, one that gives you both far more control over how this ends." "What option?" Chloe asked. "You," Dominic said. "As the injured party in all of this, you have the right to negotiate the terms of the default yourself rather than leaving it to me. If you wanted, Chloe, you could walk away holding real leverage over the very family that tried to humiliate your mother out of a room." Chloe looked at her mother, then out at the city stretching below the window, and felt the shape of an entirely different future beginning to take form. Chloe spent the next day in the audit office on the 9th floor, buried in paperwork that would have overwhelmed her a week earlier. Now it felt strangely clarifying, like finally being handed the instruction manual to a machine that had been running her life without her permission for months. Dominic's legal team had assembled everything by mid-morning: the original loan agreement, the amended prenuptial clause targeting her mother's apartment, and a formal notice of default addressed to Gerald Whitmore, ready to be filed the moment Chloe gave the word. "You don't have to do this today," Dominic said, sitting across from her at the small conference table where the documents were spread out. "You've had a difficult week. There's no rush." "I want to do it today," Chloe said. "Have spent my whole life letting other people decide the timing of things that happened to me. I'd like this to be one thing I control from the start." She read through the default notice line by line, a habit she'd developed fast after learning what happened when she didn't. The document was precise and cold, exactly the way Gerald Whitmore had probably assumed his own lawyers would eventually write something similar about someone else's failures, never imagining it would be aimed at his own company. "This declares the loan in default as of this morning," the lead attorney explained, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia who had barely looked up from her laptop since Chloe arrived. "Once filed, Whitmore Holdings has 30 days to either repay the full balance, including penalty interest, or begin formal negotiations to surrender assets in place of repayment." "They won't be able to repay it," Dominic said. "Not with the credit lines frozen. Not with the market already reacting to rumors about the broken marriage. I'd estimate they're already down considerably in projected quarterly revenue." Chloe set down the pen she'd been holding, more affected by that sentence than she expected to be. Not because she felt sorry for Gerald Whitmore, but because of how easily an entire company's fate had been quietly tied to her personal life without her ever being told. "How long has this been happening?" she asked. "The market reacting, I mean, before I even knew what the loan agreement said." "Since the day you walked out of the reception," Patricia said. "Word travels fast in circles like this. Once people heard the marriage collapsed within hours of the ceremony, and once Sterling's credit freeze became public knowledge among the right people, investors started pulling back. Nobody wants to be attached to a sinking company." Chloe thought of Harrison standing on the club steps as the cars pulled away, his expression somewhere between fear and confusion, and realized he must have understood at least some part of what was coming even then, even if he hadn't fully grasped the mechanics of it. Nora arrived a little before noon, carrying 2 coffees and a small paper bag of pastries, settling into the chair beside Chloe without needing to be asked. "I thought you might need reinforcements," she said, glancing at the stack of paper covering the table. "I think I need a law degree," Chloe said, managing a tired smile. "But coffee works too." As they worked through the afternoon, Chloe found herself asking more questions than she expected to, not just about the default notice, but about the broader structure of the negotiation to come. What assets did Whitmore Holdings actually hold? What divisions were profitable versus struggling? What a fair settlement might look like if the goal was accountability rather than simple destruction. "You're thinking like someone running a company," Dominic observed at one point, watching her cross-reference 2 spreadsheets without being asked. "I used to run my own consulting business," Chloe said, "before Harrison convinced me it would look better if I stepped back and focused on being a wife who supported his family's image. I forgot how much I liked this. Actually working through a problem instead of just performing calm about it." "You don't have to forget it again," Dominic said simply, and something about the plainness of the statement stayed with her longer than she expected. By late afternoon, Patricia had finalized the formal default notice, ready for filing. Chloe reviewed it one last time, her mother sitting quietly beside her, Dominic standing near the window with his arms crossed, watching the city below rather than the paperwork, giving her space to make the decision entirely on her own. "File it," Chloe said. Patricia nodded and sent the document through with a few clicks, the digital equivalent of a door closing somewhere across the city, in an office where Gerald Whitmore was probably still convincing himself that charm and old connections would be enough to make this problem disappear. Chloe sat back, exhaling slowly, feeling the weight of the decision settle into something that felt less like triumph and more like resolve. This wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about making sure a family that had built its comfort on quiet, unspoken debts finally had to answer for every one of them, in the open, where no amount of charm could smooth it over anymore. "What happens next?" Nora asked. "Now," Dominic said, turning from the window, "we wait for Gerald to realize he has 30 days and no way out. And based on how these things usually go, I doubt it takes him more than a week to come asking for a meeting." He was wrong. It took 4 days. The message came through Dominic's office on a Thursday morning, forwarded to Chloe with a short note attached. "Gerald wants to meet. He's asked that Harrison be allowed to speak first. Your call entirely." Chloe read it twice before responding. Part of her wanted to refuse outright, to let the default notice run its full 30 days without granting either of them the satisfaction of a conversation. But another part of her, the part that had spent the last week learning how to read contracts and default clauses instead of just trusting the people who wrote them, understood that showing up herself meant she controlled the terms of the conversation instead of leaving it to lawyers alone. "I'll go," she told Dominic, "but I want to run it. Not you, not Patricia. Me." Dominic studied her for a moment, something like approval settling into his expression. "It's your leverage," he said. "You've earned the right to use it however you want." They met at a restaurant on the Brooklyn waterfront, a quiet place with large windows facing the water, chosen specifically because it was neutral ground, far enough from both families' usual circles that no one would recognize them or interrupt. Chloe arrived with Nora at her side and 2 of Dominic's men waiting discreetly near the entrance, though Dominic himself stayed back at the office, trusting her to handle the room alone. Gerald Whitmore was already seated when they arrived, looking older than Chloe remembered from the wedding, his usual polish worn thin by 4 days of watching his company's stock value slide. Harrison sat beside him, quiet in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, none of the easy confidence he'd carried into every room Chloe had ever seen him in before. "Thank you for coming," Gerald said, standing briefly as they sat down. "I know we haven't given you much reason to trust our intentions lately." "You haven't given me any reason," Chloe said, taking her seat without ceremony. "Let's not waste time pretending otherwise." Gerald's jaw tightened, but he nodded, accepting the correction. Harrison finally spoke, his voice quieter than Chloe had ever heard it. "Chloe, I owe you an apology. A real one, not the kind I tried to give you at the gallery. I didn't understand how deep my father's arrangement with Sterling's family went. I found out about the loan collateral 3 days ago, the same as you probably did." "That doesn't make it better, Harrison," Chloe said. "It makes it worse. You married me without even knowing why your own father wanted the wedding to happen." Gerald cleared his throat, redirecting the conversation before it could spiral further. "I'll be direct. The default notice has put us in an impossible position. We can't repay the loan balance within 30 days, not with the credit lines frozen and investors already pulling back. I'm asking for an extension, 90 days, perhaps more, enough time to restructure and find alternative financing. No, Chloe said. The word landed flatly across the table, and Gerald blinked, clearly having expected some room for negotiation before being shut down outright. Chloe, Harrison started. I'm not finished, Chloe said, cutting him off with a calm that surprised even her. I didn't come here to discuss an extension, Gerald. I came here to tell you what actually happens next, because I've spent the last 4 days learning exactly what your company is worth and exactly what it would take to make this right. She pulled a folder from her bag, the same kind Dominic favored, and slid it across the table. Gerald opened it slowly, and Chloe watched his face shift as he scanned the terms she'd worked out with Patricia over the previous 2 days. You're asking for controlling shares, Gerald said, his voice tightening. That's not a settlement, Chloe, that's a takeover. It's what's fair, Chloe said. Your family built a marriage arrangement designed to protect your company at my mother's expense, and mine, without either of us ever agreeing to be collateral for anything. I'm not interested in 90 more days of you finding new ways to delay the truth. I want the controlling shares transferred to a trust in my name, effective immediately upon settlement, in place of the loan repayment. In exchange, I'll consider the default satisfied, and Sterling's firm will release the remaining pressure on your other credit lines. Gerald stared at the document, his hands visibly unsteady. This would mean losing the company entirely. Everything my father built, everything I've spent 30 years growing. You should have thought about what you were risking, Chloe said, before you decided my mother wasn't worth the manners you'd show any other guest at that wedding. Harrison looked between his father and Chloe, something breaking open in his expression, guilt finally catching up to him now that the consequences had a face and a name attached to them. Dad, she's right. We did this to ourselves. All of it. Gerald sat in silence for a long moment, staring out at the water beyond the window, the weight of the decision visibly settling over him. Finally, he looked up, defeated in a way Chloe had never expected to witness from a man who had once looked at her mother like she was something to be swept out of a room. I'll sign it, he said quietly. I don't see another way forward. Chloe felt no triumph in the moment, only a steady, quiet certainty that she had finally stopped letting other people write the terms of her own life. She slid a pen across the table, and Gerald picked it up with a trembling hand, the sound of it scratching against paper the only noise in the room besides the water lapping gently against the dock outside. The signing ceremony was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at Citibank Tower, in a conference room on the 31st floor that Chloe had never set foot in before, but somehow already knew the shape of, having spent the last 2 weeks living inside rooms exactly like it. Glass walls, long tables, the particular hush of a place where decisions worth millions of dollars got made quietly, without anyone raising their voice. She arrived early with Nora and found Dominic already there, standing near the window in a dark suit instead of his usual coat, reviewing a final copy of the paperwork with Patricia at his side. Nervous? Dominic asked, glancing up as she walked in. A little, Chloe admitted. Mostly because I keep waiting for something to go wrong. It's been that kind of month. Nothing's going wrong today, Dominic said. Gerald signed the settlement 4 days ago. This is just formalizing the transfer. Paperwork, signatures, done. Nora sat quietly near the far end of the table, watching her daughter with an expression Chloe couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, mixed with something like disbelief at how far the last 2 weeks had carried them from the country club where all of this began. Gerald Whitmore arrived a few minutes later, alone this time, no lawyers flanking him, no confident stride announcing his presence the way it had at the wedding. He looked smaller, somehow, though nothing about his physical appearance had changed. Harrison came in behind him, hands in his pockets, quiet in the way he'd been at the waterfront restaurant. Chloe, Gerald said, nodding stiffly as he took his seat. Mrs. Whitfield? Nora inclined her head politely but said nothing. She hadn't spoken directly to Gerald since the wedding, and Chloe suspected she had no intention of starting now, not when silence carried its own kind of weight. Patricia distributed the final documents around the table, each stack neatly organized with sticky tabs marking every signature line. Chloe scanned her copy one more time out of habit, though she already knew every clause by heart after reviewing it so many times over the past several days. The transfer covers 61% of Whitmore Holdings' voting shares, Patricia explained for the record, her voice even and professional. Effective upon signature, Chloe Whitfield becomes controlling shareholder and executive director, with full authority over restructuring decisions. In exchange, the outstanding loan balance held by Sterling Enterprises is considered fully satisfied, and all frozen credit lines will be released within 5 business days. Gerald picked up his pen, his hand steadier than it had been at the restaurant, though Chloe suspected that had more to do with resignation than genuine calm. He signed each page methodically, sliding them across the table when he finished, unable to quite meet Chloe's eyes as he did. "I built this company from almost nothing," he said quietly, mostly to himself. 30 years, and it ends because of a wedding that lasted 3 hours. "It ends," Chloe said, "because of 30 years of decisions that led to that wedding happening the way it did. The marriage was just the moment everything finally came due." Gerald didn't argue. He simply nodded, sliding the last page across the table, and Chloe picked up her own pen, signing the acquisition documents with a steadiness that surprised her, given how unsteady she'd felt walking into that country club 2 weeks earlier, believing she was starting a marriage instead of ending one man's carefully hidden scheme. Harrison watched the whole exchange without speaking, and when it was finished, he cleared his throat. "Chloe, for what it's worth, I hope you run it better than we did. The company, I mean. It employs a lot of people who never had anything to do with what my father decided to do to you and your mother." It was the first genuinely honest thing Chloe had heard him say since the wedding, and she considered it for a moment before responding. "I intend to," she said, "starting with making sure nobody at this company ever gets away with treating people the way your father treated my mother in front of 200 guests. Harrison had nothing to say to that. He simply nodded, something like relief crossing his face, as though he'd been waiting for permission to finally stop performing an apology he didn't fully know how to give. Patricia collected the final signed copies, sliding them into a folder that would soon become official record. The quiet paperwork ending of what had started as the loudest, most humiliating moment of Chloe's life. Dominic watched from across the table, arms crossed, a small, satisfied look settling into his expression as the last signature dried. "Congratulations," he said, once Gerald and Harrison had gone, the room emptying out until it was just the 3 of them again. "You're officially running a company now." "I'm officially running a company I know almost nothing about," Chloe said, half laughing at the absurdity of it. "I hope you're planning to help me figure out where to start." "My advisory team will be at your disposal for as long as you need them," Dominic said. "But I don't think you'll need as much help as you're expecting. You handled everything from the loan discovery to this signing better than most executives I've worked with for years." Nora stood, smoothing her blazer the way she had in the elevator 2 weeks earlier, though this time the gesture looked less like nerves and more like quiet pride. "Your father would have been proud of you today," she said. "Not because of the company, because of how you got it." Chloe looked down at the folder in her hands, at the weight of everything it represented. Her father's old debt, her mother's years of hiding, Harrison's careless cruelty, and the strange, unexpected protection of a man who had walked into her wedding uninvited and changed the entire shape of her life. For the first time in 2 weeks, she felt something close to peace. The house sat right at the edge of the water, a modest coastal home compared to Dominic's estate, but grander than anything Nora had ever imagined owning outright. White shutters, a wraparound porch, and a garden already half-planted with the same herbs Nora had been growing in pots on a cramped apartment windowsill for 15 years. Dominic had purchased it 2 weeks earlier, quietly, and put the deed entirely in Nora's name before anyone had even finished discussing where she might want to live next. "You didn't have to do this," Nora said, standing on the porch the morning they moved the last of her boxes in, her voice thick with something she was trying hard not to let become tears. "I know I didn't have to," Dominic said. "I wanted to. Consider it 15 years of overdue interest, finally paid." Chloe watched the exchange from the porch steps, a coffee mug warming her hands against the early autumn chill coming off the water.
It had been 3 weeks since the signing at Citibank Tower. 3 weeks of learning how to actually run a company instead of just owning the paperwork that said she did. Whitmore Holdings had already stabilized faster than anyone expected, mostly because Chloe had spent her first week firing 2 executives who'd built their careers flattering Gerald instead of doing honest work, and replacing them with people who actually understood the business. Harrison had taken a quiet severance package and moved to Chicago to work for a cousin's firm, away from the wreckage of his father's decisions. Gerald himself had stepped back from public life almost entirely, spending his days in a smaller house upstate, the kind of quiet retirement he'd probably imagined for someone else, not himself. Dominic joined Chloe on the steps once Nora had disappeared inside to arrange her furniture exactly the way she wanted it, no longer needing to ask anyone's permission for how her own home should look. "How does it feel?" Dominic asked, "running a company you never planned on owning?" "Terrifying," Chloe admitted. "Exciting too, in a way I didn't expect. I spent so many years thinking I had to shrink myself down to fit into rooms like Harrison's family built. Turns out I just needed the right room." "You built that room yourself," Dominic said. "I only opened the door." Chloe glanced at him, considering that for a moment. In the weeks since the wedding, she'd come to understand Dominic as something more complicated than the syndicate leader everyone in Harrison's world had been terrified of. He was careful in ways that surprised her, patient in negotiations, oddly gentle with her mother, sharp enough in business to make grown executives sweat through their suits, and entirely uninterested in taking credit for any of it. "Can I ask you something?" Chloe said. "The debt to my father. You could have repaid it quietly years ago, the way your family originally wanted. Written a check, sent flowers, called it settled. Why show up the way you did? 10 cars, at my wedding, in front of everyone." Dominic was quiet for a moment, watching the water. "Because your mother spent 15 years protecting you from a debt that was never hers to carry alone," he said. "And when I heard where that wedding was being held, and I understood what kind of family you were marrying into, I realized quiet gratitude wasn't going to be enough anymore. Some things need to be settled where everyone can see them, especially when the people doing the humiliating think no one's watching closely enough to stop them." "You didn't know for certain Harrison would treat her badly," Chloe said. "You just decided to show up anyway." "I suspected," Dominic said. "Gerald's reputation wasn't exactly hidden from people who know how to look. I wasn't going to take the risk of being wrong by staying home." Chloe smiled, something warm settling in her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee mug in her hands. "Well," she said, "I'm glad you decided not to take that risk." They sat together for a while, watching the tide come in slow and steady against the shoreline, the kind of quiet neither of them had experienced much of in the last month. Inside the house, Nora had turned on music, something old and familiar that used to play in their small apartment kitchen years ago, and the sound of it drifting out through the open windows felt like the closing of one long, difficult chapter. "What happens now?" Chloe asked eventually. "Between all of us, I mean. I don't imagine syndicate leaders usually stick around to help their old family friends unpack moving boxes." "I'm not most syndicate leaders," Dominic said, a rare, genuine smile crossing his face. "And I don't intend on disappearing anytime soon. Your mother's part of my family's history, whether either of us likes the formality of that word or not. And you," he paused, considering his next words carefully, "you've turned out to be someone worth knowing for reasons that have nothing to do with debts or contracts." Chloe felt her cheeks warm despite the cool autumn air, something unspoken settling comfortably between them, not rushed, not forced, just present in a way that felt entirely different from anything she'd known with Harrison. Nora appeared in the doorway behind them, wiping her hands on an apron she'd owned longer than Chloe had been alive. "Dinner in an hour," she called out. "Dominic, you're staying. I won't accept an argument about it." "Wouldn't dream of arguing," Dominic said, standing and offering Chloe a hand up from the steps. As the sun began sinking lower over the water, painting the porch in soft gold light, Chloe looked back at the house behind her, her mother's home now, truly hers, free of hiding, free of debts,
free of every quiet sacrifice 15 years had demanded of her. Whatever waited next, for the company, for her mother's peace, for whatever this careful, growing thing was between herself and Dominic, Chloe finally felt like she was stepping into a life built entirely on her own terms. For the first time since that humiliating afternoon at the country club, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She was ready for it.